Hello everyone, today we bring you a courtroom battle unlike anything you've ever seen. Most people accept their fate in court and move on, but not Pam Bondi. When she was hit with a sudden fine that made no sense, she knew something was off. But she had no idea this case would turn into a fight for justice that would leave even the judge questioning his own ruling. This wasn't just about a fine, it was about power, control, and the fight for what's right. Pam wasn't just defending herself, she was about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. So, what did she do that completely changed the game? Stay with us until the end, because this case didn't just end with a ruling, it set a precedent. Pam Bondi had been in courtrooms more times than she could count. She knew the rhythm of the proceedings, the way judges handled cases, the predictable back and forth between attorneys. But as she sat in courtroom 21B in the New York City Federal Courthouse, she had no idea she was about to step into a battle that was anything but ordinary. This hearing was supposed to be routine, a quick review of a minor procedural dispute, a few clarifications, and then she'd be moving on with her day. Across the room, State Prosecutor Preet Bharara adjusted his tie, shifting slightly in his seat as he prepared for what was supposed to be an uneventful case. But the moment Judge Lewis Kaplan walked into the courtroom, Pam felt something was wrong. Kaplan carried himself with an authority that went beyond confidence. It was absolute certainty. Tall, with deep-set eyes and a graying beard, he projected the image of a man who didn't just oversee cases, he controlled them. Most judges took a moment to settle in, glancing over their files before beginning proceedings. Not Kaplan. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. Pam straightened slightly. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Kaplan continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of State Code 22F and is therefore subject to a fine of $15,000, payable immediately." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Pam's brow lifted slightly. A predetermined ruling? No argument? No chance for defense? Even the prosecutor looked uneasy. His glance toward her was almost apologetic, as if even he hadn't expected the case to move this fast. Pam calmly folded her hands, keeping her voice even and composed. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Kaplan barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear, the law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. Something was off. The air in the room felt too still. Even the court's stenographer repositioned in her chair, sensing something was unfolding that wasn't standard protocol. Pam had seen her share of courtroom surprises, but this wasn't just a ruling. This was a statement. She glanced at Kaplan, studying him carefully. There was something behind his eyes, a confidence that went beyond mere judicial authority. This wasn't just about the law. This was about putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Kaplan leaned back slightly, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something else. He challenged. "But I assure you, the outcome will be the same." That was when Pam knew. This wasn't just about a fine, it was about her. She adjusted the papers in front of her, not because she needed them, but because it gave her a moment to think. The fine wasn't the issue. She had fought bigger legal battles than this. But the principle of it? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Kaplan's gaze directly. "Then I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. Bharara shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. The court stenographer's hands hovered over the keys, waiting for something she knew wasn't going to be ordinary legal procedure. Even the spectators in the back of the courtroom leaned forward slightly, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at the legal brief in front of her. She didn't really need it. She already knew what she was going to do. Judge Kaplan thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Before anyone else could speak, Pam raised her hand, a small but deliberate gesture, a silent signal she wasn't finished. And what came next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Pam Bondi could feel every set of eyes on her, the attorneys in the gallery, the court clerks, even the bailiff. They all sensed it. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was about control. Pam had been in legal battles before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a message. Judge Kaplan sat still, watching her carefully. He had expected compliance, he had expected her to nod, accept the fine, and move on. But Pam wasn't the type to back down when something didn't sit right. And this wasn't right. Pam exhaled slowly, keeping her expression composed. She turned a single page in her legal pad, more for effect than necessity. Then she looked up, her voice calm but pointed. "Before I proceed, Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something." Kaplan raised an eyebrow. "Clarify what, Miss Bondi?" She let the silence stretch for just a moment. Timing was everything. Pam kept her voice measured. "Are you stating that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" The courtroom shifted ever so slightly. A few attorneys sat up straighter. The court stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, waiting. Even the prosecutor, Preet Bahara, tensed for the first time since the hearing started. Kaplan hesitated. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was there. Pam saw it, and so did everyone else. She had just forced him into a corner. If he said yes, he would be admitting that he was bypassing due process. If he said no, he would have to let her argue her case. Either way, she had just taken control. Checkmate. Kaplan exhaled slowly. "I'm saying the violation is clear and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly. "Interesting." Kaplan's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back just slightly, her tone almost casual. "It's just, in all my years practicing law, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it." She let the words settle over the room. Then she added, "What's the phrase? Unprecedented." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Even the bailiff shifted slightly, as if sensing the power dynamics in the room were shifting. Kaplan's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't used to being challenged. Pam had just put him on display. She had forced the entire room to acknowledge that something wasn't right. Kaplan let out a slow breath. "Miss Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics." His voice was sharp. "If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. "Very well. Let's talk about State Code 22F, the one you claim I violated." She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. "You say the law is clear. That's interesting because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations." Kaplan's eyes narrowed slightly. Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational. "The language in subsection C, for example, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. Silence. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it too. Kaplan straightened in his chair, his tone sharpening. "Those cases do not apply here." Pam didn't miss a beat. "Don't they?" She turned another page. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Sullivan v. State of Illinois was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds." She let the words sink in before adding, "And I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent." Kaplan clenched his jaw. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. "Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law." A few spectators exchanged glances. The prosecutor, who had been sitting quietly up until now, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may—" Kaplan lifted a hand, cutting him off, his eyes staying locked on Pam's. There was a long pause. Then finally Kaplan spoke. "Very well. You may present your defense." A murmur swept through the gallery. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating, yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Kaplan did something unexpected. He turned toward the clerk and said, "Court will take a 15-minute recess." Then, without another word, he stood and walked out. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm, but inside she knew what had just happened. Kaplan wasn't ready to rule against her outright, but he also wasn't ready to give in. He needed time. Time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited, which meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone, and what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. The courtroom had settled into a hushed, tense quiet. Pam Bondi remained at the defense table, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her legal pad, though she wasn't reading from it. She didn't need to. Her argument had been airtight, and Judge Kaplan knew it. That was why he had called for the 15-minute recess. Not as a procedural break, not for convenience, but because he needed time to regroup, to find a way to regain control. Pam knew that calling for a recess in a minor procedural hearing was already unusual, but when the doors to the judge's chambers swung open and Kaplan re-entered the courtroom, he wasn't alone. A second judge followed him. Pam's stomach tightened just slightly. She recognized him immediately. Judge Loretta Preska, a senior judge, higher ranking than Kaplan. The moment Preska stepped in, the energy in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't just Kaplan looking for a way to handle her argument. Someone had pulled strings. Pam quickly adjusted her posture, ensuring she remained completely unreadable. This was a calculated move. Preska's presence meant that Kaplan wasn't confident enough to make this ruling alone. Pam's mind sharpened, running through every possible angle. Had Kaplan called Preska in as reinforcement to back him up? Or was this a political play? Either way, it didn't matter. Because if they had brought in another judge, it only meant one thing: they were taking her argument seriously. Judge Kaplan took his seat, clearing his throat before addressing the room. "Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Preska sit in on this matter." Pam's lips pressed together in the faintest hint of a smile. Requested? She didn't believe that for a second. This wasn't Kaplan's decision. Someone had called in a favor. Judge Preska, who had been watching Pam closely, gave her a slow nod. Her voice was calm but authoritative. "Ms. Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of State Code 22F. Pam met her gaze evenly. "That's correct." Preska clasped her hands in front of her, glancing at the documents on the bench. "You believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't believe it, I know it." A ripple of murmurs ran through the gallery. Pam could sense the weight of what was happening. Kaplan had been trying to push her into a corner. Now, with Preska here, he was stepping back. This was now bigger than just a fine. Preska arched an eyebrow. "I appreciate your confidence, Miss Bondi, but let's discuss specifics." Pam knew what was coming next. "You referenced Sullivan v. State of Illinois. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion?" Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the shift. So that was their move. Kaplan had brought in Preska to poke holes in her argument. Pam folded her hands together. "I'm aware of that ruling, Your Honor." She let that linger for half a second before adding, "but I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that in this case was not done." Preska nodded slightly. She had expected her to say that. Pam watched as she carefully considered her next words. Then, after a brief pause, she said something she hadn't expected. "Then, let's talk about that." Preska turned toward the prosecution table. "The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him?" Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't anticipated that, but she welcomed it. Pam turned her head as a man stood from the back of the room. Officer Michael Rivera, a municipal enforcement officer, middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Pam could already tell what type of witness he was going to be. Confident, direct, the kind who expected to be believed without question. She slowly rose from her chair, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I would." Judge Kaplan gestured for Rivera to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took his oath, sat down. Pam paced slightly before turning toward him. "Officer Rivera, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation?" He nodded, "Yes, ma'am." Pam turned slightly toward the jury box, where no jury was present but where the public sat watching. "And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred?" Rivera exhaled, as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. She let a beat of silence hang in the air. Then she spoke. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? Rivera hesitated. No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. Pam gave him a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Rivera shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back toward the bench, her voice clear, unwavering. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. Judge Preska sat back slightly. She knew she was right. Pam pressed forward. So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Kaplan's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Preska, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. Kaplan had expected to win this argument. He had expected Preska's presence to back her into a corner. But instead she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Kaplan exhaled sharply, then, to her mild satisfaction, he said, "This court will take another recess." Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back, but when the court reconvened, what Kaplan did next was something no one saw coming. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Judge Kaplan called for another recess. Pam Bondi remained seated, her hands lightly resting on her legal pad. She wasn't reading her notes. She didn't need to. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the case law she had cited, they were all burned into her mind. What concerned her now wasn't the law. It was Kaplan's reaction. Something was off. Pam had faced plenty of judges who ruled with a heavy hand, but Kaplan, he wasn't just ruling, he was maneuvering. And now, with Judge Preska brought in, he was buying time. But for what? The door to the judge's chambers swung open again. Kaplan strode back in, his expression unreadable. Preska followed, but this time her posture was different, more reserved. Pam's instincts sharpened. Something had shifted. Kaplan took his seat, cleared his throat, and spoke. Miss Bondi, you've raised questions about the evidentiary process regarding this fine. Pam didn't blink. That's correct, Your Honor. Kaplan nodded toward the city attorney. The prosecution has agreed to allow further clarification. Officer Rivera is still present for additional questioning. Pam tilted her head slightly. Interesting. They weren't arguing against her anymore. They were stalling. She glanced at Rivera, the enforcement officer. He sat stiffly, as if he had been briefed during the recess. Pam calmly rose from her seat, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. She walked toward the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Rivera, I just have a few additional questions for you. He nodded. Of course, ma'am. Pam paused just long enough before speaking again. You stated earlier that you issued this violation based on clear non-compliance with State Code 22F, correct? That's correct. Pam kept her voice even. And you determined this violation based on your own observations. Rivera hesitated. Yes, ma'am. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. You didn't document the violation with photographs, written reports, or third-party verification, correct? Rivera shifted slightly in his seat. I didn't need to, ma'am. I've worked in enforcement for over 20 years. I know a violation when I see one. Pam smiled. I'm sure you do. She turned toward the judges. But here's the problem, Your Honor. The appellate court has ruled on multiple occasions that fines cannot be enforced solely on the basis of a subjective assessment. She picked up a printed document from her folder, holding it up for the courtroom to see. Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. She tapped the page. The ruling states that an administrative penalty imposed without evidentiary substantiation is subject to reversal upon judicial review. Pam let that hang in the air, then, turning back to Rivera, Officer, would you say your assessment was evidentiary or subjective? Rivera didn't respond immediately. Pam could see the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes flickered toward the judges. He knew he couldn't say it was evidentiary because there was no evidence. The courtroom was silent. Pam turned back to Judge Preska, her voice cool but firm. Your Honor, without documentation, without photographic proof, without third-party verification, this fine is based on nothing more than assumption. She gestured toward the prosecution table. The city attorney has not provided any independent corroboration that this alleged violation even occurred. Pam turned back to Kaplan. So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? The silence was deafening. Judge Kaplan's fingers drummed against the bench. Pam saw the frustration, the calculations happening behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at Preska, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. Kaplan had expected to win this argument. He had expected Preska's presence to back her into a corner. But instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to dismantle the case against her. Kaplan exhaled sharply, his voice measured but tight. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Kaplan did next was something no one saw coming. The courtroom was silent, not the routine kind of silence that settled before a judge delivered a ruling. This was different. It was the kind of silence that came after a battle. Pam Bondi sat motionless at the defense table, her fingers resting lightly on her legal pad. She had no need to write anything down. The case had already been won. All that remained was watching how Judge Kaplan would handle his own unraveling. Across the room, Officer Rivera shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of his testimony, or rather his inability to provide any concrete evidence, having sealed the prosecution's fate. Pam had stripped their argument to its bones. No documentation, no verification, no admissible proof. She had given Kaplan every opportunity to justify his ruling, and at every turn he had come up empty. He knew it, and so did everyone else in the room. Judge Kaplan exhaled slowly, then finally spoke. Miss Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments. Pam didn't react, because she knew what was coming next. When people like Kaplan were cornered, they didn't surrender. They found a way to reassert their authority. Sure enough, Kaplan sat up straighter, his voice regaining its usual weight. However, this court still finds that the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam didn't blink, so he was doubling down. Pam exhaled slowly, nodding as if she were carefully considering his words. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. Can you read back the last statement, please? The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating Kaplan's words verbatim. Pam turned back to Kaplan, her voice calm but pointed. Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof? The room went completely still. Kaplan's fingers twitched against the bench. Pam let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of it. Finally, Kaplan shifted. Miss Bondi, this court has discretion. Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. There it was, his last attempt to regain control. Pam stood up slowly, stepping toward the bench. It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards. A few attorneys in the gallery nodded subtly. Pam turned to face the room. Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? She gestured slightly toward the spectators. If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. She paused, letting that sink in. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Pam turned toward the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders sitting in the gallery. Imagine the implications of that. Her voice was measured, deliberate. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. She turned back to Kaplan. And if they challenge it, too bad. The court has discretion. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Pam's gaze didn't waver. That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority. The weight of her words settled over the room. For the first time in the entire hearing, Judge Preska spoke, her voice calm but firm. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process? Pam nodded once. Not just due process, Your Honor. She looked directly at her. Judicial integrity. A heavy pause. Then finally Preska turned toward Kaplan, her voice even but decisive. "I concur." Kaplan's jaw tightened. Pam could see it in his eyes. He had lost. The city attorney finally interjected, his voice uncertain. "Your Honor, if I may." Kaplan held up a hand, his face unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration behind his eyes. There was no winning this. Not for him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kaplan exhaled. "This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement." His voice was stiff, most reluctant. "The fine is overturned." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Kaplan tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Preska watching her, her expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, she heard Kaplan's voice one last time. "Miss Bondi!" She turned. Kaplan's eyes met hers for the first time since the hearing began, his voice quieter. "I underestimated you." Pam gave her a small, knowing smile. "You wouldn't be the first." And then she walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent. And somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam Bondi didn't just win, she set a precedent. She proved that standing up for justice isn't just about knowing the law, it's about fighting for what's right. Personally, I think Pam Bondi's victory in this case is a wake-up call for all of us. It's inspiring to see someone stand up to a system that sometimes feels rigged, especially when power seems to outweigh fairness. I believe judges should have authority, but it's cases like this that remind me how easily that authority can slip into overreach if left unchecked. The law isn't just a tool for control, it's a shield for justice, and Pam proved that by refusing to back down. Maybe you see it differently. Perhaps you think judges need that discretion to keep order, that without it, chaos would reign. I get that. There's a balance to strike and not every case is black and white. But for me, this story hits home because it's about holding those in power accountable, no matter who they are. What's your take? Do you side with Pam's fight for due process, or do you think the court's initial stance had merit? I'd love to hear your perspective. It's these debates that make stories like this matter. Thanks so much for watching and sticking with us through this wild ride. If this got you thinking, drop a comment below, hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss our next deep dive into justice, power, and everything in between. See you in the comments.